Kevin Raposo here with SpeedyPhotographer.com, and in this video I'll explain how and when you should use the texture, clarity, and dehaze sliders in Lightroom. Now if you're looking for something specific, concepts and times are up on screen. A common mistake is cranking clarity to plus 100 without understanding how it affects the look of the picture or knowing when texture and dehaze are a better choice. We're going to start by looking at the texture tool, which adds contrast based on something called frequency. And to help you understand frequency, let's take a look at this picture of a plane wing that I took on a flight to Portugal. The upper half of this picture has a low frequency. The color and the brightness of the sky and the plane wing is consistent, and there are only a few sharp edges. Now the bottom half of the picture has a high frequency. The color is pretty consistent, but the clouds have many sharp edges and changes in brightness. And the texture slider focuses on adding contrast to those high frequency areas of the picture. If I crank my texture up to plus 100, you can see that the clouds become much more defined, but the sky, the plane wing, and the overall color of the image only changes slightly. Now if I bring texture down to negative 100, the clouds essentially turn into a blur, but the edges of the plane wing, which are low frequency, are still sharply defined. Now when we look at the clarity slider, we can see that it focuses on adding contrast to the midtones. When I crank my clarity up to plus 100, the contrast is added mostly to the clouds and the plane wing, but the sky is pretty much the same because most of it falls in the highlights. And again, if I bring clarity down to negative 100, both the clouds and the plane wing become blurry. So the key to understanding the difference between texture and clarity is to look at the plane wing. The plane wing has a low frequency, but it specifically falls in the midtones. So the texture tool has much less of an effect on it than the clarity tool. If I crank both sliders down to negative 100, the edges of the plane wing are still clearly defined with the texture slider, but they become a blurry mess with the clarity tool. Now last but not least, we have the dehaze slider, which is meant to be used for restoring color and contrast to a washed out picture. And because I shot this picture through a plane window, it's a perfect tool to use here. If I increase dehaze to about plus 30, you'll see that most of the contrast and saturation in the midtones and highlights is restored to the picture. Now the trick with the dehaze slider is to only make slight adjustments. If I crank it up to plus 100, the color begins to look completely unrealistic and amateur. If I need to restore more contrast, I should be looking at my histogram and then adjusting the blacks or the whites instead. Look how much better it is when I add negative 40 to the blacks instead of plus 100 to the dehaze slider. Okay, so now let me go over a few examples of when and how I would use each of these settings. The texture tool mostly comes in handy when I shoot portraits. If the person has wrinkles on their face, it does a much better job of softening them than the clarity tool does. This is because the wrinkles are high frequency, so the texture tool can remove them without reducing the contrast of the lighting. It also comes in handy when I want to emphasize those wrinkles. For example, I cranked up the texture in this picture to draw more attention to the skin of the animal. If I tried to do the same thing with clarity, it would affect almost every area of the image because most of the exposure falls in the midtones. Now the clarity tool comes in handy when I want to create a more dramatic or a tougher look to my picture. In this picture, I wanted the athlete to look more intense, so I brought up my clarity, which increased the contrast of the lighting on their face. And in this picture, I really wanted to bring out the tough terrain, so I cranked up my clarity and then I reduced the vibrance a little bit to bring out that aspect of the image. Finally, the dehaze tool is useful when shooting underwater, through a pane of glass, or when dealing with strong reflections. For example, I took this picture at a hockey game, and while I did my best to press the camera lens against the glass, the dehaze tool helped to restore contrast and color to some of the washed out areas of the image. So hopefully this clears up exactly what each of these tools do and how you can use them in real world situations. Don't forget to click that subscribe button coming up in a second, and if you want another hour of free training, head over to SpeedyPhotographer.com. And I'll see you in the next video.